I want to show you how to make these fun picture frames out of scrap wood. They're pretty easy to make, and it's a great way to use up those random pieces of wood you've been holding on to for some project down the line. Well, this could be that project. A few years ago, we made these raised beds for the garden, and making these raised beds was a huge project. We have 10 of them, so it took me a while to do. They've been an absolute game changer for us. They're great. They keep the gophers out, they made irrigation easier, they give us more control over the soil, they mean we don't have to bend down to harvest stuff. I'll bet you want to know how to make these. Well, too bad. This isn't that video. I'll get around to making that eventually, so now's the time for that whole subscribe thing so you'll know when that comes out. I'm Clicky, Gardener Crew's engineer and husband, and Nacho's around here somewhere being extra helpful. What this video is about is what to do with all that scrap wood from a project like this, because believe me, there was a lot of that. Specifically, let me direct your attention here to where the sheet metal meets the corners. These corners are 4x4s, and the corrugated sheet metal is inset, so there's no sharp edges to catch on. You can get an idea for what that looks like with this little template I have for marking the ends of the 4x4s. That left us with just piles and piles of these little strips of wood. Well, I decided to get creative with that and make some picture frames. So one of the things we've been using these scrap pieces for is as a little fence to sort of discourage the dogs from going into the herb garden. And you can see that behind me here, but Nacho's getting big enough now that that's not really effective as a discouragement, so we're just going to have to go with training. All right, let's get into how these are made. I wanted to make picture frames we could use in our breakfast nook. Specifically, we wanted frames suitable for 6x9 photos, so we wound up with a frame size of 8 3/8 by 10 3/16. One of these axes is determined by how wide most of your scrap wood is, so you'll have to base this on the random pieces of wood that you have lying around. It helped that all of mine were basically the same size. As you can see in this design, the pieces are just stacked together and then glued. Let's go cut up our scrap wood to match your design. Because these are out of the corner of a 4x4, we'll have to trim off that rounded edge. For that, you'll need a table saw. Figure out how wide your pieces should be and then trim them all down to a consistent width. In my case here, I'm going with 1 3/16 of an inch because that's about how much I can get consistently after trimming off that bit. Working with the table saw should always remain a little bit scary, even if you know what you're doing. Don't get complacent. That's easy to do with these sorts of repetitive tasks. Then we'll cut everything down to length. If I'd been really clever, I would have come up with a length that was roughly divisible by the length of most of the pieces I have, but I didn't do that here because of the photo size I wanted to use. I use a miter saw for this. Cutting in batches on the table saw with a sled or something is, again, scary, so I didn't do that. So you may be wondering why these things are all crazy colors and look like some weird graffiti art or something like that. Well, they're not that, but what they are is the product of Koo using them to paint other things. He usually likes to prop them up on things and use them to keep things off the ground. So now we're going to turn them into something really cool. Once you have all your pieces cut, it's time for arranging. Think about your frames and what they're going to look like. Do you want to show knots? Do you want to show imperfections? Or do you want to hide those? Or in this case, just maximize the amount of crazy color. Koo would generally like to hide them. Me, I like to have a balance, but in this case, we're going for absolute maximum color. So you've got 2 places to hide if that's what you're doing, the back of course, and most of the middle bits, since they'll be covered up by the photos. To help prevent these from sticking to things while the glue is setting, I like to lay them out on a piece of wax paper. I find the wood glue doesn't tend to stick to this if a little leaks out the back. I'm just using standard old wood glue here, nothing fancy. So arrange accordingly on the wax paper depending on what you're going for. Then tip all but the one on the top onto its side. And then apply a light bead of glue. You definitely don't want to get carried away here because you don't want any bleeding out onto the front of the frame. To help prevent that, you could get one of these silicone brushes here and spread out the glue evenly. I actually really like these things, and you can just toss them in a little jar to rinse them in between frames. Now, tip them back on their backs and push them all together. Clamp them on 2 sides. Want to be careful to avoid bowing here, so I sort of lightly clamp first. Then I'll do a quick check to see if any glue is splooging out the back. So, no big deal. We just take a damp paper towel and wipe it off. And then take something heavyish to place on top. And clamp down just a little bit more. If things start to bow, back off. And get things straightened out again. Also, double check that everything is still lined up on the sides, and then leave this to set for as long as your glue says. Mine just says 30 minutes. While that's happening, let's talk about photo mounting. You might have noticed the trick here earlier when we looked at the frames, but there's no obvious way to mount a photo to this thing. It's just a flat wood surface. The trick is magnets. Specifically, these little neodymium magnets. They're nothing super strong, but they're stronger than most, and you can easily buy them in quantity. So I made 24 of these frames, and at 8 magnets per frame, you can bet I went through a lot of these things. The magnets are inset into the frames. Basically, I just drilled a hole about as deep as the magnet and nestled them in there. Unless you have a drill press, and I don't, it's difficult to be precise about this, so I just put some tape on my drill bit to be a guide. You want to err on the side of going just a hair deeper than you need to, but you definitely don't want to accidentally drill all the way through. So the easiest way to figure out what size drill bit you need to use is with calipers. I love these things. Calipers are great. So you just measure your magnets, and you can get a pretty precise answer. It's also great to have a lot of drill bits in your drill index, have a lot of gradation there. What I wound up with was 25/64 of an inch for these magnets. Specifically where to drill the holes for these is a bit up to you, depending on the size of your frame and the desired picture size. You want to shoot for the far corners of your intended picture size, but not actually the corners. It should be just a little bit inside so that there's enough to grab onto. Now, did I mention that I made 24 of these frames? After measuring out exactly where to place these on 3 or 4, that was getting old fast, and I made at least one measuring mistake. So this calls for a jig. You can make this yourself out of wood pretty easily, but here's where this video is taking a left turn. I love 3D printers for this sort of thing.
With a little CAD work, I can make a perfect jig to get this right every time, and I can even make it a drill guide too. If your horizontal and vertical offsets aren't the same, by the way, you'll want to make 2 jigs for this.
I'm not going to get into CAD here too much. I like to use OpenSCAD for stuff like this because I always find myself thinking this way. Like, okay, I need a cube of this by this by this, and then I need to move over by this much, and then add another cube, etc., etc. Probably because I'm thinking visually like a programmer, but this is basically what that looks like. I've got a surface with labels clearly marked, little edges so that I can place it against each corner, and finally a drill guide so that I can drill mostly straight down. Now that we've got our jigs set up, we can start drilling out these pieces into a batch. If you're doing a lot of these like I did, you'll want to assembly line this process so you don't have to keep switching tools and activities. For the first one though, we're going to go step by step so we can make sure we have a handle on the process and that we didn't screw up any measurements. Once you have all of your holes drilled, you need to secure the magnets in place. I found wood glue did not work for this at all. The magnets frequently just popped right out after curing. It really wants a more porous surface to adhere to than metal. I wound up using this stuff that actually foams up a little bit and fills out the hole. You definitely have to be careful not to use too much of this as it can foam out and come above the surface of the frame. This is definitely not what you want, but if it happens, you can sand it down or cut it off with a utility knife. It's not the end of the world. So the next thing to address is that distance between the surface of the frame and the surface of the magnet. When you mount a photo here, the magnet on the other side of the photo will make a little indentation in the photo. If that's all right with you, then absolutely skip this step. If you want to avoid it, well, back to the 3D printer. We just need to be a bunch of thin little squares, a bit bigger than each of the magnet holes for everything to rest on. You'll need a bunch of them, but they print super fast. Check the software you're using to see if it can do sequential printing. These are short enough that this is a pretty good option. That's where the print head actually finishes an individual piece before moving on to another one and printing on the same print surface. So if you have these, it's time to get to gluing again. I found that a tiny drop of super glue on the frame and the back of the offset piece does the trick nicely. The foamy glue also works pretty well, but again, tiny drop. Finally, how do we mount these to the wall? There are a bunch of options for that. Traditional wire and hook options would work here. In this case, we wanted to do a grid layout with alternating landscape and portrait orientations for effect. In other places where I want that super precise photo frame layouts, I would use these neat honeycomb picture hangers. I absolutely love these. They let me do perfect grids that are always level and never need to be straightened. For these though, I decided to make my own hangers. So, back to the 3D printer yet again. I made these neat hangers. This design is called a French cleat. It's a 2-part hanger and one side goes on the frame. The two 45-degree angles join together for a secure connection to the wall. The frame side is glued to the back. You just need to glue it level on there and at a consistent distance from the edge. This is a little bit fiddly, but not too bad. I found that the Gorilla Glue works pretty well for this. For the wall side again, of my design, there's these little nails guides here. These are at a 45-degree angle and are the width of a finishing nail. Again, calipers are your friend here to find the right size. So I'll put the links to the OpenSCAD files in the description so that if you need to make any adjustments to these while you're printing them, you can do that. So that's it. I thought this video was about turning scrap wood into something nice on your walls, but I wound up talking as much about how useful 3D printers are for making random one-offs. Even though there's a bunch of 3D printed bits going on here, it's all hidden in this rustic design. If you wanted to fancy it up a bit, you could sand these down and maybe add some shellac to make them shiny. For me, though, I just went with the raw wood look, or the painted wood look. I'd considered using boiled linseed oil on these other ones, but I was concerned about it seeping into the photos, so I didn't do that. I'm not sure if that's a valid concern or not, honestly. Anyway, I hope you find something creative to do with all that scrap wood you have filling up your garage.